Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. Winter has just descended upon us here in Melbourne and I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids either indoors or outdoors or not at all without the help of equipment. So greenhouses, grow lights, humidifiers, really just me and them making friends or not. So if that sounds like your conditions, come along, join the ride. I'm an amateur struggling my way through, but it might help you with your orchid journey too. Which is kind of the subject of today's video, plant lovers, because I have just come back from the tropical island of Bali, where I had hoped to see some wild orchids, or orchids of any type really, particularly in bloom, but hey ho. And my wish was answered, not in bloom, but a local species I saw absolutely everywhere. Seeing them growing in situ on their trees, doing their thing in slightly different circumstances with each one, but a lot of consistency in how they grow, made me really think I might need to rethink or just look at more closely how I'm growing similar types of Dendrobium species. So we'll look at that footage, but we'll also come back and look at these three species I've got here and just have a chat about what I might need to do to make sure they're living their best lives. So this video is about, well, a particular Dendrobium that's growing in the wild, but it's really about how some epiphytic Dendrobiums grow in the wild. So without any further ado, let's just go back in time to Bali last week and look at all the wonderful examples of Dendrobium crumenatum that I saw growing there. So here I am doing my best David Attenborough. So this is Dendrobium crumenatum. Fantastic dendrobium that's fairly common throughout Southeast Asia. So many things to talk about, but firstly, it's amazing to see them, to see any orchid growing in the wild, in fact. First things first, Dendrobium crumenatum. The crumenatum bit is Latin, meaning leather money purse. Not quite sure where that comes from. The leaves are quite leathery, so maybe it's from that. But first things first, it is a beautiful orchid. Now, as you can see, it flowers from the stem, from the pseudobulb. There you go. Has very long arching stems of beautiful white flowers, commonly called pigeon orchid, but here in Bali, they call it the dog orchid for some reason. But anyway, beautiful white flowers, and they are fragrant, don't last very long. And apparently it can flower at any time, triggered by a change in temperature, a cooler change in temperature and rain. Now, as you can see, there's new growths coming out here and here. And this shoot here is probably the next one to bloom, I'd imagine. And a bit like, say, an epidendrum, it shoots its flower spike from the very top of the cane. And then that cane, I am presuming, is not going to bloom again. Now, this plant is just amazing. So it's growing in a plumeria, a frangipani, and perhaps as you can see, very little shade. I mean, it's early morning now, so there's plenty of shade. So I think what this exemplifies more than anything is there is not one rule suits all for any type of orchid, but particularly Dendrobiums. So this one is in incredibly exposed locations all over this part of Ubud. We're in the mountains. It's growing on the side of palm trees and plumeria trees like this, frangipani trees, and a few other larger trees. And in some instances, it's basically in direct sun. So there are parts of the day when it will get a bit of shade, but other than that, a lot of direct sun. So what you will notice is the leaves are in quite bad condition. So they're eaten, they're sun damaged, they're a little yellow, but this is what the orchid wants. Now, the other thing I've often said is there are epiphytes, and there are epiphytes, and there are epiphytes. And this one, as you can see, is growing in the scar of an old branch. So there's a little depression in there where a little bit of matter may have collected. But I've also seen these, and in fact, look, there's one right there clinging directly to the side of the plant. So what you can see is that the root system is really extensive and all over the stem and the branches of the tree, and it's wrapping around under here and clinging to the moss and the lichen to not only secure its position on the branch, but also obviously to get moisture. So many things to think about. So firstly, it has just rained this morning, but now as you can see, the sun is shining. So this plant is very exposed. It got direct rain, there's no shelter. And obviously I can feel it now. The leaves are moist and the root mass here is moist, but very quickly when the sun comes out, it's going to dry and really dry. Obviously, a bit of moisture is going to be retained in the bark and the lichen and the moss of the tree, but essentially quite a severe dry. It has rained a little bit just about every day, so there is a lot of airborne moisture, and of course it's very humid and very warm. This is not a cool climate. So imagine trying to grow this orchid and trying to replicate these growing conditions in pot culture. Tricky. Because what you can really see quite clearly is how exposed these roots are to the air, how quickly they dry, but how quickly they get replenished with moisture, and how much air is around them, and also airborne humidity around all of these roots. Very interesting. So growing this, I think, will be relatively tricky and beyond me, I think, because this is very much a warm to hot grower. It would just need these sort of balmy conditions, I think, or a hothouse condition to really flourish. I'd love to know if anyone is growing it successfully indoors in a not tropical environment. And I guess the other thing to think about too is food. Now look at that. So it is not really in much at all. There's very, very little matter there. And some of these other little plantlets that you can see on the side of the plant, again, very little. So there's a little bit of moss, but that's probably it. So let's talk food, baby. How much food is this plant going to get? Now, there'll be a little sort of breakdown of matter here. So there will be things, little bits of leaves and material that catch in there and break down. There will be droppings from birds and insects, but pretty few and far between. So this plant is going to really make the most of whatever comes its way through this quite extensive network of roots all the way across there. Now, maybe also the lichen and the moss is giving it something as well. There'll be perhaps something symbiotic in the moss, perhaps mycorrhizal in there, helping the plant access nutrition. But essentially, the moral of the story is not a huge amount of food is this plant getting. And I think you can see from the size of it, it's not a particularly vigorous plant. So I've seen a few where the stems are a little bit longer, and obviously the flower spike is much, much longer, but not what you'd say a particularly vigorous plant. And I think an indication of the fact that it's getting fairly poor nutrition. I mean, it's getting the right amount of nutrition for it, but perhaps if you were growing it in pot culture, you'd be feeding it once every 3 or 4 days in warm weather and once a week. I don't know, as I perhaps would, but there you go. So perhaps your orchids don't need as much fertilizer as you think. But there you are, plant lovers. Dendrobium crumenatum growing wild here in Bali, and they're just everywhere. Literally, I can see some on palm trees there and coconut palms over there. They're absolutely everywhere, but just so interesting to see an orchid in its native environment, getting pretty much full sun, not much protection, very exposed. I'd love to see it in bloom. Can you imagine? Literally every second tree has got them, and when they're in bloom, they're these huge white sprays of flowers which are fragrant. Imagine walking through that. It's like an orchid forest. It would be absolutely stunning. Anyway, plant lovers, signing out from Bali. Now, talk about opportunistic growing. I'm just going to spin the camera around and show you where this one is growing. On the roof. Look at that. So the roots are clinging into the straw thatch, and there we are. And in fact, all along the roof line, there's another couple over on the end there. The orchid has taken root. You can imagine the seeds being blown across and just washing down and clinging in there and taking root. And you can see those coconut palms over there, all covered in the same orchid. And you probably can't see behind me, but these coconut palms over here have got orchids all the way down one side, so that same Dendrobium. You can perhaps see them best on that one over there. I'll try and take a close up. But imagine when they're all in bloom, each of these branches, and you can see those, I think, hang on, where are we? You can see those quite clearly. Each of those stems covered in a cloud of white orchids. Wouldn't that be a sight to see? Isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting to see a plant growing in its native habitat? Now, I'd be very interested to know if any of you grow that orchid. Flowers apparently don't last for a very long time, but they're incredibly fragrant, and there's a lot of them. All the pictures I've seen, the sprays are sort of massive. Can you imagine what it will be like? Because they'll all be blooming at the same time, and they're literally on every palm tree and every frangipani tree. I mean, it would just be breathtakingly beautiful. But anyway, so if anyone's growing it, let me know. Definitely a warm to hot grower, so it'd be tricky for me. It will be an indoor plant all the time. I'm not sure that I've even seen it for sale here, but maybe I haven't been looking. Now, I also visited an artist's house, and traditional Balinese houses are beautiful and sort of built around a compound to a very particular organisational plan. And amazing courtyard gardens with the most beautiful use of potted plants and all those kind of tropical plants that you look at and go, oh, they're growing in the wild and they limp along indoors here. But anyway, so gorgeous to see. But growing on one of his trees was that orchid. And I said, did you plant this? What happened? He said, no, no, just turned up. It just started to grow on the tree. And his is at about chest height, I guess, so really easy to see. And again, doing exactly the same thing as the others were doing in the garden of the place where we were staying. And he said, although the common name is pigeon orchid, in Bali it's called dog orchid. And maybe that was just something lost in translation. But anyway, that's what he said. So what that makes me think, plant lovers of the world, is, I have some similar types of quite epiphytic Dendrobiums. As I said in that video, there are epiphytes and there are epiphytes and there are epiphytes. And as you could see from that Dendrobium, it really is an epiphyte, a real clinger, and its roots traveling through the bark. Interesting. So it's not parasitic, it's epiphytic, but it's making use of all the fissures and cracks in that bark to find moisture and nutrient wherever it can. Interesting. But what you can see is the roots are very exposed to water, very exposed to light, very exposed to air. So when we look at these orchids, which grow in a very similar manner, perhaps in different areas, but in the same way, you kind of got to figure out how to replicate those conditions in pot culture if you can't grow them on a mount, which would obviously be the best way to grow a lot of those orchids, but I kind of can't. So I grow mine in pots. So let's have a look. Now, the first one we'll look at is this one, which I've made a film about before. This is Dendrobium rindjaniense, and this is actually named after a volcano on the island next to Bali, which is Lombok. All of those islands, by the way, are in Indonesia. Everyone in Australia will be very familiar with Bali, as it's a very popular holiday destination. Perhaps in the States, it's more of a tropical, faraway ideal, but in Australia, it's very well known. Anyway, so this plant comes from that part of, well, it's named after a volcano on the next island, but it's actually common throughout Indonesia and grows in a very similar manner. And I have got mine in a terracotta pot with a smallish bark mix, and it's a little gritty, a little grainy. Now, I haven't repotted this plant for, I'd say actually 4 years. I bought it as a seedling, and last year it flowered for me for the first time. I'll drop the picture in now, and I'll link the video here. So what I am thinking, in spring, I think when the weather warms up, it might be time for me just to unearth this, have a look at what's going on, have a look at its root system. There are no roots coming out the bottom of the pot, but I think what I want to do is maybe just change the bark to slightly bigger, make it a little bit looser in there and give the roots more space. However, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we'll see. Anyway, this one happens to grow in almost the same conditions, but slightly higher elevation than the one we saw. So this one can take cooler weather, but from the same neck of the woods. So in pot culture, I think the important thing is to maybe have, if you can't grow it on a mount because of your climate, which I can't, a pot with aeration would really help, and then a loose bark. Now this one is Dendrobium aphyllum, which is quite famous, has beautiful sort of washed out mauve flowers, and you can see how long that is. And you can see from Dendrobium crumenatum in the video, although that is growing quite upright, the flower spikes do cascade, but you can see where it is in the tree. Now, aphyllum is much more of a dangler, so it does need that height in the tree to live its best life. Now, this one needs a bit of a drier winter. So again, looking at how that plant was growing, you can imagine that if the climate has a dry period, which many of them do, you can see how dry it's going to get, because that bark is going to dry out really quickly and evaporate really quickly. So unless there's a lot of airborne humidity, or it's a high altitude orchid that's growing in a cloudy sort of area with lots of airborne moisture around, which those roots could absorb, it's going to be fairly dry, quite dry for quite some time. Interesting to note. So this one, aphyllum, does need a bit more of a drier winter. And if I'm not mistaken, this is an older cane. If I'm not mistaken, those little nubs might be the beginnings, there we are, of flower buds. It'll bloom in spring if it's going to bloom. This is a new little division for me because I managed to kill my old one, I think by keeping it too moist and cold in winter. Once again, I put this in quite large bark, and had I thought of it at the time, I probably should have drilled holes in this pot just to give those roots much more aeration and more light penetration. But there you go. Now, the last species I want to show you is this one, which I am very excited by because of its size. Now, this is Dendrobium thyrsiflorum. Now, if you Google that, you will see it has the most incredible pendulous bunches of flowers, kind of like tangerine and ivory grapes, but massive, which come out from the tops of the cane. Now, I bought this one as a seedling in one of those plastic tubes from a hardware store for $8.95, maybe 4 years ago. In fact, if you look there at the heart of the plant, you can see that little two-leafed cane there. It's probably about the size it was when I bought it. So it's taken about 4 years to get to this size, which I think could be flowering size. These plants do take a bit of time to get to flowering size, but you see the canes are really long, there's enough of them. I think this could be a goer. Now this one, like aphyllum, is a Himalayan orchid, so it's growing all the way through those Himalayan countries, India, Nepal, Bhutan, then across into China and the northern parts of Laos, Vietnam, etc., as is this one. This one though, thyrsiflorum, is a bit more higher altitude, so it is a cool grower and can take these cool temperatures, but again from a misty foresty area. The thing I guess to look at this is the habit of it and what it wants to do. So it's not super pendulous because the canes aren't that long, not particularly upright, but you can imagine what this would look like clinging to the side of a tree, which is where it wants to be. And once again, I have used in this a bit of a mix of medium bark and perlite. So I don't think I've repotted this for a couple of years either. It put on huge amounts of growth in this last season. I think at least 3 or 4 of these canes are last year's growth, and they've just matured beautifully. Now it does bloom in spring, so if it's going to bloom, it might well bloom this spring, which is quite a few months hence as we've just gone into winter. If it does, believe me, plant lovers, I will ring every bell and make a film about this. But once again, interesting to see how this plant would be growing in the wild and how you might need to replicate that. The other thing that would work would be small wooden baskets, quite open, filled with large bark. Or, again, if you could mount it, which I can't, and I can't because of the humidity, because Melbourne has quite dry, hot summers. Things dry out really quickly. And if you don't have sort of a misted shade house, it's just too much to try and keep things like that moist and humid throughout the summer. So for me, it's pot culture all the way. But it was great to see those plants in the wild because it's really made me understand what air movement, free draining means when you see a plant growing like that, literally clinging to the side of a tree or taking advantages of small little nooks and crannies. Fascinating. The other thing too, very, very little obvious sources of nutrient too, because there's just nowhere really for matter to accumulate. Now in some of those trees there were sort of rotten areas where a branch had fallen off. Now that, you would imagine, would be a great spot for an orchid to nestle. But crumenatum hadn't chosen those spots. The things that had were things like bird's nest ferns, because they like that kind of condition a little bit more. Again, an epiphytic fern, but likes a little bit more matter in the fork of a tree or the sort of dead branch holes to cling to, but not that orchid. Other orchids, other species from other parts of the world would love it, but not these dendrobiums. Anyway, plant lovers, that's my ramble for the day. I hope you enjoyed that. I found it so fascinating and interesting to see. That was the only orchid I saw growing in the wild, and believe me, I looked and I looked and I looked, and actually there weren't that many orchids around, which did surprise, disappoint me. I saw a couple of cattleyas and a couple of gardens in bloom, and I did see a whole bed of spathoglossus, which I couldn't stop the car in time to video, and they were just stunning, and I've never seen them in bloom before, so missed that opportunity. And there were white phalaenopsis in, you know, every hotel and restaurant, as there are all around the world, so that's not new. So really, in and around Ubud, which is where I was, which is sort of getting to a reasonably high elevation, but still tropical and certainly not cool, even in the cool season. Certainly a warm climate, beautiful. Anyway, that was the only orchid I saw, but it was literally everywhere. So that is the orchid that's found its happy place there. My happy place, plant lovers, will be with you next week. So if you've enjoyed this ramble, do subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. Who knows what next week's adventure will be, but there's a lot of things in bloom for the first time for me. I'm just waiting for them to open, so we'll see what's ready next week. Anyway, I hope all's well wherever you are. I got home last night at 1 a.m. from the airport, so I'm a little bit ratty this morning. Never mind. Next week, I'll be perky, and I look forward to seeing you then.